Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad that you have joined us for our study in this series of lessons from the school down in Pensacola at Milestone, the Northwest Florida School of Biblical Studies, for this series of studies on the history of religion. And I so very much appreciate the efforts that are being made in this particular area, this now being the third year of this particular series, and most of it this year is going to be taking up with a lot of what we find during the period of the Restoration. And I'm so very grateful for the study of that, simply because of the fact that there are so many throughout the Brotherhood have very little knowledge about church history to start with, and they certainly don't have a great deal of information about the things that went on during the Restoration period. And there's an old adage that if you don't study your history, you are doomed to repeat it. And that's the very thing I think that is happening a great deal nowadays. Some of the issues that took place back in the Restoration period, there was the instrument, the problems with the instrument being added to the use of sacred songs, and that created a significant amount of division during that particular period, along with the missionary societies and the problems that all of that caused. And all of these things are now being resurrected again, and to a very serious degree in many areas. And so we're having to fight a lot of these battles again simply because of the fact that many of our brethren have not spent a great deal of time in the discussion of these issues. So I'm so very glad that the school here, Brother Guyton and the leaders here, have made the decision to speak about these issues and help our brethren to come to a greater knowledge of things having to do with the history not only of religion but of the church. So I'm grateful to be involved in this, even though it's by this particular medium. I'm very sad over the fact that we're not able to make it down to Pensacola this year. It's one of the highlights of my year to be able to spend time with brethren at the lectureship, is to renew acquaintances and be in a fellowship one with the other. And it's just something that all of us, I think, greatly enjoy. And we're having to miss out on it because of the circumstances that we're facing presently, but hopefully we'll have an all clear before too long and be able to meet together again. But I'm grateful for the technology that we have and the means that we have to be able to meet the way that we do. And so I'm grateful for the effort that's being made, and I'm hopeful that the effort that I'm able to make this evening will be something that will be a helpful addition to the study and the theme that has been provided. As you will see on the board for our study this evening, what has been assigned to me is the subject that involves the question, what did the Civil War, what effect did the Civil War have upon the church? And I kind of want to keep this in line with the theme as well, and that is to see the effect that the Civil War had on religion, especially within the states. And we'll kind of join the two together as we go along. It's very obvious that the Civil War had its effect upon a great deal of things as far as the nation was concerned. It had a great deal of effect on families. It had an effect upon the economy. It had an effect on education. It had an effect upon the church. And as a consequence of this, you're going to see that is something, the scars of which have been very long in overcoming, but in hopes that this will be something that never be repeated again. This is something, again, that not only do our students need to discuss things and learn of things having to do with the Civil War and all the things that were behind its occurrence, but also the effects that it have upon things on the spiritual plane. And so we want to discuss just a little bit along that line about how that the Civil War did have its effect upon the nation and upon religion and upon the church. There are numbers of things that have been discussed in reference to the Civil War as to its background and its cause. There have been a lot of debates over that, but yet it's still, as the debate continues in many areas nowadays, there are obviously some settled reasonings as to why that the Civil War was fought to begin with. You know, one of the things that you think about was some of the people that were involved in this stated. What you see here is a photograph of Mr. Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. Now, I want you to keep in mind these dates as we go through our discussion. The Confederacy was established February the 8th, 1861. That's when it was evidently formally set up. You're going to see the first shots fired at Fort Sumter, where the Confederates are firing against the Union there, the Union soldiers at Fort Sumter at April the 12th in 1861. Now remember those dates. They're integral to everything that actually we're going to be discussing. What you find here in this particular photograph, this was a photograph of a man that, as I stated, was the vice president of the Confederacy. In March of 1861, he was quoted in a Savannah paper in having stated that slavery was the primary reason for the rupture in the nation or among the states. Now that kind of gives you an idea of what many within the South thought. That was not the exclusive reason, but that was a mainstay, particularly in regard to many of those that were in positions like him. Now, Mr. Stephens was a small man, but seemingly small in mind as well, because he seemed to be a rather profound racist as well. But this again, I think he is just simply trumpeting the fact that this is the sentiment of many of those in the South at that time trying to maintain the practice of slavery. But that was not the only thing. What also that you had going on was also a bit of an agitation that was taking place not only in the North but in the South against the government. You had the North that was industrializing at a very quick rate. There was a lot of growth going on. There was a lot of money that was being spent, a lot of building taking place. Industry was going just with wildfire. You had especially the areas of steel and things of this nature, because the railroad was becoming a big thing at that particular point in time. So they were needing the steel for the rails. They were needing steel for the engines and all of the parts of the railroad cars and things of this nature. You had buildings going up that were using some of the old girders, the old steel girders. So a lot of steel was going on, but that was not the exclusive aspect of the industry that's taking place in the North. There were all kinds, also mercantiling, which is pretty much what was taking place where the South was concerned. But in the North, where all of this was happening, they were looking for cheaper labor in their industries or materials that would help them, that would bring about some cheaper labor, because the Europeans were flooding our markets with cheaper products. And it was creating this rift with the government, and hoping that they might be able to do something that would stem the tide of this. Now, that was going on while the industry was increasing there in the North. There were people that were moving from South to North because that's where the money was, it's where the jobs would be. And so with the influx of all this, it made it difficult for them to be able to have all the labor that they might have needed at that particular point, so they were wanting more. In the South, most of the industry that was taking place there, if you could call it that, had to do with agriculture. A lot of cotton, obviously. There was the invention of the cotton mill and things of this nature, and consequently from this, you had many people that were spending money from the standpoint of establishing businesses to sell cotton products, the mercantiling and the production of clothing and things of this nature. That was a major thing as far as the South was concerned, but in the South, they were not growing as fast as was the North, and so there was a concern in the South. As you well know, if you've done any study from your history and the setup of our government, where there is more population, there is greater representation in Congress. And so with more of the population going north, up to this particular point in time, the South had had a stronger representation. But now that more people are coming in and flooding the North, the South is afraid that there's going to be more representation in Congress and that they would take control, and if they did, they would set high tariffs on the materials that would be produced in the South. And that essentially is one of the things that would eventually take place, especially after the war began. And so when that took place, then the South is essentially cut off from much of its money-making capabilities. And so now they're concerned about what the government might have to say about their particular rights. And so states' rights became an issue. That was partly also what was involved a little bit later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when there were the territories out west, that there were arguments concerning the particular areas in which they may go, whether they may turn into slave states or whether they would turn into free states. So that was part of the argument that was going on. Then, on top of that, one of the main things as well that created a great deal of friction between the North and the South that had to do with the Dred Scott decision that took place in 1857. And if you're noticing your screen there, it will tell you that this is something that holds that Congress does not have the right to ban slavery in states, and furthermore, that slaves are not citizens, such as is the case here with Dred Scott versus Sanford. The court upheld the exclusion of Negroes from the Declaration of Independence, and it held that Scott lacked standing to sue for his freedom because he was a slave and therefore without rights unconditionally guaranteed by U.S. citizens. And so that was one of the great issues that helped escalate the problems, obviously slavery being at the basis of this as well. So now it became, with the territories out west, the arguments having to do with the new states that may be coming in as to whether or not they're going to be free or whether they're going to be slave states. Then, according to the statement that was made by the writer of the book Slavery, who was a former historian for the National Park Service, Dwight Caithley, I think is how you say his name, he stated the issue was not so much the existence of slavery, but the extension of it. So all of this begins to play a significant role in how the country is going to come apart at the seams and over all of these particular issues. Now, it's going to have its effect, as I said a moment ago, even in our homes. There would be those that when the decision comes down as to what side of the fence one was going to be on, there were divisions within households. There were those, especially along the line of the Mason-Dixon line, those in those particular areas. You had some that, of course, would be more of the mindset to follow along with the position of the Union, to be abolitionists. Some in the very same household would be sympathetic to the slavery position or to states' rights positions or whatever it is that they may choose. And therefore, you've got a division in the household, and even some of these who had men or young men that would dwell in that house, some, of course, would go the way of the Union, some to the Confederacy, and may end up meeting on the battlefield. Now, you can imagine the effect that might have on the household itself, about the father and the mother as to what their positions might have been. Houses divided over this. Communities would divide over it. You're seeing a constant uproar within the country over these particular positions, and especially when the war started itself, when a lot of the males took off to go to war, you start seeing then the other effects, particularly when it comes to the spiritual aspect, which is what we want to talk about for just a little bit at this particular point in time. You think about it like this. You had two particular views here. And both of these views, abolitionists, pro-slavery, whatever, they all thought, both sides thought, that God was on their side. He was behind their cause. And at the beginning of the war, you had more of an interest in some areas where religion was concerned, less in others, but primarily at the beginning there was less. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, show you exactly what the circumstances were. But as time goes on, and as the war begins to trot along, there seemed to be a little bit more interest in things spiritual. You had sons, you had husbands, brothers, nephews, and the like heading off into the battlefield. People back home are concerned. They're concerned not only for the family members, but they're concerned for the plight of the nation. They began to be more mindful of spiritual things and being prayerful, and that the God of heaven would help our nation come to a healing and bring our boys back home. From the vantage point of a Methodist minister who wrote a book called Christ in the Camp, he made this observation. He said, there is more prayer among the people generally than heretofore. Prayer for the country, prayer for brothers, sons, and husbands, calls for the people so often to the mercy seat that it must almost necessarily increase the spirit of devotion among them. Hence, there's a good deal of religious feelings in our congregations. There's another fellow by name of J. William Jones who was a regimental chaplain in the war. He was also a Methodist minister, just kind of giving you a view from a vantage point of those that were denominationalists during that particular period of time. He also observed in one of the books that he wrote, the evangelical denominations were well represented in rank and file, and even went on to point out how many ministers would join in. In fact, it was one of the regiments he mentioned had 5 ministers in the one regiment. And so that kind of gives you an idea across the board among those that were amongst the denominations or amongst those that were so-called Christians at that particular point in time, how they were thinking. They were all joining up. Jones also spoke about a battle that took place at Darksville, Virginia, among the Confederate ranks. And he mentioned here that there were 7 men in this particular battle. 7 men that had master's degrees from the University of Virginia. 42 others in this battle were college graduates, and among whom of those there were 19 theological students, and one of them was the son of Robert E. Lee. So that kind of gave you part of the disposition and the thinking of many of those in the communities during that time, among those that were so-called religionists at that particular point, those that calling themselves Christians. Now we might have different views about, as they did during that time, discussing as to whether or not one could go to war or not. We could pass all kinds of judgment against these individuals, but you need to think, first of all, if they were going to engage in this, what their thinking might be if they're going to sign up for one side or the other. And what their thinking may be concerning their spiritual status. If they're going to pledge themselves to one of these causes, they've got to know, and I think they do know, that the possibility, and it's a great possibility, that they could die. Well, they certainly did not want to enter into the fray without being spiritually prepared. So you kind of look at what the disposition of many of those that would enter into the fray would do, if in fact that they're doing certain things with their local congregations to prepare themselves spiritually should they not come home at all. Jones also recollected an interest in spiritual things. This is after the war had started, been going on for a little while now. This particular incident took place close to Orange County Courthouse in Virginia. He mentioned the fact here that there was an occasion where there was it must have been around a river, close to that area. There was about 5,000 soldiers that witnessed this event taking place. There were some 82 of the soldiers that were amongst regiments from Virginia and Alabama. 82 of them were baptized on this occasion. That kind of gives you an indication as to what they're thinking, but they wanted to be prepared should they die. I also thought about that for a minute. And I'm not certain as to the fact as to what their religious background was, those 82, but if in fact that they were of Calvinist persuasions or anything of this nature, I wonder if it ever entered their mind the importance of baptism. Many of those among denominational ranks don't believe that it's necessary to salvation, so I wonder why they thought it was so important that they be baptized. That's just added a little piece of information in connection with that. But what about the effects upon communities religiously? Perhaps one of the best examples to show the effect that the war would have on a community and upon the religious community as well would be most likely the situation that takes place in West Tennessee at Shiloh, which was a Methodist church there in close to the Tennessee River. And Shiloh, of course, incidentally, meaning house of peace, which is rather interesting, since it was the case in March of 1862, or in April of 1862, rather, that it was anything for a couple of days but peaceful. Nevertheless, you have a situation here close to this church building that you're looking at here. This is not the church building that was there in the time of the war. The actual building that was there during the skirmish that took place at Shiloh was actually demolished in the melee that took place. This one was built several years afterward, but it's in this vicinity, actually, where all of this occurred. What you had was there were some scouts up on above Pittsburgh Landing, north of that were watching for the approach of Union gunboats, and they actually saw them, sent word to General Johnston that they were in the vicinity. Colonel Mouton, or Mouton, whatever his name was, however how you pronounce it, from Louisiana, took his regiment and they went up to Pittsburgh Landing, and here's where they, of course, would encounter the gunboats that would come in. Pittsburgh Landing, of course, had its pier, places where they would disembark from the steamships and things of this nature, that the paddle wheel boats, rather, that took place there throughout the years. And this is where the gunboats would come in. Well, the Louisiana regiment here, Colonel Mouton and his troops, would engage the gunboats. Of course, obviously, they're evidently not much of a match for the strong military capability that the gunboats would have, and then the Louisiana troop would then retreat, and they would go back to the area close to where the Shiloh church building would have been. But now, one of the interesting things about this in this particular period, when this was going on, it's interesting to me that there was not any further skirmish here. But the shots may have been so far away they may not have heard them. But nevertheless, here was the circumstance. Just north, just to the left of this picture, and when you go back just a little ways from here, north of what you're looking at here on this screen, General William T. Sherman had 7,000 troops in camp there. He'd been there about 3 weeks. Now you've got this group here from Louisiana. You've got other Confederate soldiers that are coming in now by the thousands. There are others obviously coming in on the gunboats, the Union gunboats. There are other thousands that are coming in here. The people that lived in this vicinity realize troubles are brewing. We are not in a good place to be. The proximity of Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers in such close proximity means there is a bad battle about to take place. And many of those that lived in that area packed up and left as quickly as they could, to get to safer areas. Essentially, they become refugees for a while, going to other areas of the country to get out of the way from what was about to take place here. So that kind of gives you an idea how it affected the community. Now, what about these Methodist people? Shiloh was the Methodist church here. How did this come along after or during the time of this situation? Well, as I stated, the building itself that was there, the original building, was absolutely demolished in the Battle of Shiloh. Now, that was in April of 1862. The building that you're looking at there on the screen was built in 1875. Now, this is some 13 years after the battle had taken place. Through that particular period of time, and this is something, incidentally, you're seeing repeated in different areas throughout the country. This is not going to be just the only place that this is going to happen. A lot of the church buildings during that time that were in close proximity to battlefields, they would be used as places of triage for those that were injured. Sometimes they would be used for even headquarters for temporary. They tried to stay out of a lot of these areas. But many of these buildings would be demolished because they were caught in crossfires, just like this one was here. The battle itself began right behind the church building. There's to the right over there, there's an open field back over there, and the Confederate troops were coming out from behind there, then meeting those otherwise from the Union coming from the other direction. So the Shiloh building gets caught in the crossfire and it gets demolished. But now the point being, again, you had a period of 13 years. This is how this is affecting the religion throughout the South, because this is where most of the battles were being fought anyway. 13 years, biggest portion of the time during that 14 years, they were meeting in what we know as brush harbors and things of this nature. Very difficult set of circumstances, I would imagine. Most of them thought, I don't know whether we need to do this and rebuild at this particular time or not, because we don't know what the circumstances are going to be. Also is the fact that it had its effect upon the economy. And so it's not going to make it easy to rebuild church buildings during that time. So for 13 years, it had its effect on this particular area as well. Now, in other areas, I think is what we wanted to talk about more specifically is what effect did the war have on the church? You know, we don't have a great deal of documentation amongst our brethren concerning the effect that the war had upon the church. Now, what we do have is rather interesting. There was a book that was put out by Brother Leroy Garrett some years ago on the Stone Campbell movement. And he documents that most of the congregations wanted peace. They desired peace. But they not only for the nation, but amongst the brethren. Because they realized a lot of the brethren were fussing among themselves about the issues that was also dividing the nation. But what they determined, a lot of the congregations, based upon some of the evidence that we do have, they were trying to keep politics out of the church. And as long as they could do that and maintain peace within the church, we could have different ideas and still be united. That was the effort that was being made during that time. And he went on to point out, with an interesting observation too, that in some of the communities, even while the war was going on, there would be soldiers from both sides, Union and Confederate, on Sunday. Sometimes the war would suspend on Sundays, and many of the soldiers would look for church buildings to go worship, Union and Confederate. And many of them would sit side by side in the same building and worship together. After the service was over, they collect whatever materials, their guns, I'm sure, and the like, and they go off to their respective places, and they may meet on the battlefield the next day. But then at least on the Sundays, they were coming together to worship together. One of those interesting situations took place in Alabama. In fact, it happened evidently several different times. And there was a particular gentleman whom many of us know from our study of history, is James A. Garfield, who became president of the United States. He was a brigadier general, fought at Shiloh, and was also a member of the church, was also an elder in the church. And you remember he let that go in order to become the president. He gave up his position, resigned from being the elder when he did that in order to be sworn in as president of the United States later. When he was at Shiloh and some other places in and around North Alabama, they were encamped at Bibbs Creek on one occasion, Big Bibbs Spring. And close by there was a congregation in which he would preach. There was also a congregation in Mooresville, Alabama. And he would preach there. Now the building that you're looking at there on the screen is the one from Mooresville, Alabama. That's the same congregation that President Garfield spoke in. It's been a long time since I've been in the building. I took that photograph about 2 years ago and I went by there to visit. But I'm not sure that you can go in now. They may have some people on occasion, maybe certain days, that may make it available for you to go in. I would recommend, if you ever have an opportunity to go by Mooresville, Alabama on some occasion, it's just right outside of Decatur. You'll never know that it's there except for the sign itself. If you pull off the highway and you go off a little road there for just a little piece, you can't see the town itself because of the stand of trees, but once you get in and under the canopy of those trees, you're stepping back into the 1800s. And it looks just like it did during that time. And this congregation of people met here for many, many years. I've been inside the building itself. The pews and everything were kept in order. The seat that President Garfield sat in upon the podium before he got up to speak was still there. It's just an interesting piece of history to go in. But this is one of those situations where there would be somebody like President Garfield, who is evidently a marvelous speaker himself, would sit and preach to those that were of the collection of Union and Confederate soldiers alike. And then the next day go about their business. Just kind of give you an idea of some of the attitudes that existed during that particular time. Now, the issue of slavery, there were a couple of things that caused problems for the church where the war was concerned, slavery being one of those issues. The other heated issue was whether or not a Christian should be allowed to go to war. That was probably one of the big causes of much of the debate during that area and during that time. Now, there were several different ones that we know about that offered some views concerning this. One of these would be, as you see on the screen, the painting of Brother Barton W Stone, who was one of the primary men that we read about in the Restoration Movement. He made this statement. He took this position that slavery was wrong both politically and morally. Then also you had Brother Alexander Campbell, who looks to be somewhat disturbed at this particular picture. Maybe he's somewhat upset with his hairdresser that day because it seems like he's having a bad hair day. Nevertheless, the circumstances at this particular point is the fact that he is one who took the position that he was altogether against slavery. He made this statement in the Millennial Harbinger. He made the claim very clearly, I've always been anti-slavery, but he then also stated this, I've never been an abolitionist. Now that's the statement that got him into trouble because it seemed like he was hypocritical and inconsistent. Problem with that is he just simply did not explain at this particular article in the Millennial Harbinger what exactly he meant. He was anti-slavery. He did not believe in it. But when he made the statement that he could not argue as from the standpoint of the abolitionist, it was simply because of the fact that it could not be argued from the biblical standpoint. The Bible does not explicitly condemn slavery. In fact, the matter is, it talks about the master-slave relationship, but doesn't explicitly condemn slavery. That's what he was talking about. If you're looking at his position, it's anti-slavery. But he tries to take the biblical position in the matter of the abolitionists. Now, that created a state problem. You had people that, of course, are going to make the argument, and they did, in dividing the church over the issue, there were those among the North and the abolitionists that then would not fellowship those that were pro-slavery. Those that were pro-slavery would not then fellowship those that were abolitionists. That was not what Brother Campbell was wanting. His idea is just like some of the others we talked about earlier, is that you could have different political views but not divide the church over something of this nature. But you can see exactly which way that it was going. In fact, the matter is, he received some correspondence on one occasion from a brother that actually had the idea that they couldn't accept anyone or fellowship anyone who was not strictly anti-slavery. And the antagonism was so great that he went on to make the point that people ought to deal with those that were pro-slavery in the same way that they would treat a horse thief. Now, Brother Campbell responds to that and likened his correspondent to the Pope of Rome and to those that were the witch hunters of Salem. In other words, you're just going to put to death somebody over a difference of opinion that cannot be sustained by the Scriptures. Now, there, obviously, when you go through the Scriptures, you're going to see some implications that slavery and that sort of practice is something that is not the best for mankind. Yet it's been something that has been done throughout the generations, until which time this country decided to bring it to an end. But this is during this particular period when all of this is going on. Let me give you another idea. Brother J.W. McGarvey, who many of us know and have studied his material, he does good work in the book of Acts and some other pieces as well. He made this observation. He said, many brethren have been swept into hopeless apostasy. This is the effect that the war was having. This is his comment on it. The zeal of many have been chilled. Distrust prevails among many who were bosom friends. The evangelical labors of nearly all have been much contracted. Churches languish. Congregations dwindle. And there's a fear that such divisions have distracted the religious sects of the day, may yet disgrace our history. So you got a good idea of what his appraisal was of the effect that the war was having. Let me go very quickly through some of the views that some of the brethren would have had concerning it and their involvement in it. For example, Brother Tolbert Fanning was a well-known preacher during this period. He was one that was highly respected, but considered one of the great preachers of this particular period. He spent a great deal of time in running a circuit through the state of Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and the like. He would kind of run a circuit holding meetings and things of this nature, always very successful, significant excitement when he would be in the area to come and preach. In November of 1860, now I want you to remember what I stated at the very outset. You remember the occasion or the date of the establishment of the Confederacy, February 8, 1861. Now, about 3 months before this, Brother Fanning is back in Jackson, Mississippi. He'd been there some other times before. When he would come to Jackson, he would go to the State House, the capital of the state, and this is what provided him the venue for his preaching, because it provided the means to have a great number of people to come in and listen. And generally when he was there, as he was some 14 years earlier, great crowds, places full, great amount of excitement. But now, in 1860, November of 1860, he comes to the State House. When he goes in, what he's hearing is the discussion among the representatives about the matters concerning Mississippi seceding from the Union. That was the discussion. The decision was made to do so, and in fact, one of the men that were there was a preacher by the name of T.W. Caskey, And he was one of those that was going to be selected to help write the resolution for the secession of the state of Mississippi from the Union. After that occurred, the excitement of anything having to do with things spiritual just absolutely bottomed out. Now, Brother Fanning preached there for, I don't know, a couple of days, but there was no interest whatsoever, very few people coming, so he would leave from here going to Alabama, over to Georgia, same thing. There was no interest. Nobody was talking about things concerning the Lord, no interest in the church, not much interest in the Bible or any such things as this. That was what was happening in November and subsequent to this with Brother Fanning. Now, at the same period of time, the interest at the time in November and December of 1860 was still high for things spiritual in the North. Brother Campbell had a meeting in Indianapolis with great success. Isaac Erritz, another great preacher during that time, was holding meetings up in Detroit, had great success there, and now in Indiana as well, and with great success there. Then shortly after that, you would see him go down into Virginia, Isaac Erritz, and try to hold a meeting down there, but he began to see now you're in the South, Virginia, one of the southern states, talking about seceding from the Union. Very little interest whatsoever in the things spiritual. You had an interesting situation that took place in Cincinnati. But W.H. Hobson began a meeting April the 5th, 1861. Now remember that date, because it would be the next week when the shots were fired upon Fort Sumter. Now the 5th, the preceding week, he begins the meeting. Has good success in that, great deal of excitement again. The mayor of the city is a member of the church. He's also involved in this as well. But just as soon as the word came, now remember something, in this time when the meetings took place, they weren't Sunday through Wednesday like they are now. They went not only for 1 week, generally they went 2, 3 to 4 weeks. So now they're in the second week of the meeting when the word came about the Confederates firing on Fort Sumter. Interest in things regarding the meeting bottomed out. In fact, Brother Hobson met with the mayor and they talked about it and said with a lack of interest there's no need to keep up the meeting, and so the meeting was canceled. That gives you the idea of the effect, because right after the word came in, the whole city of Cincinnati just went into a frenzy and excitement, strangely as that may sound, over the prospects of the coming war. Just another very quick point. We noted Brother Garfield just a moment ago. When he was in Ohio, which is where he was from, he was president of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. He was president of the college there at Hiram, Ohio. And when the news of the war came, he resigned from that position, asked for an opportunity to enter the Union Army, and received a commission, being a lieutenant colonel, would then end up being a brigadier general. One of the interesting things about that is when he left that school, there were some 250 students that also joined up, many of them serving in the 42nd Ohio Regiment, which is the one that Brother Garfield led at that particular point. And so seemingly they didn't seem to have a great deal of reservation about entering into it. One other one I want to mention before I close. We talked about Shiloh just a few minutes ago. Many of you are familiar with Brother T.B. Larimore. He was a well-known preacher in North Alabama, around the Florence area for many, many years. He also was at Shiloh. You might remember I mentioned there were some scouts that were looking for the gunboats that would be coming down from the north on the Tennessee River. Brother Larimore was one of those scouts. He's the one that spotted the gunboats. He's the one that wrote the memo to General Albert Sidney Johnston of their arrival. And so it's just kind of give you an idea of some of our brethren that were engaged in the skirmish. Later he went back to his home area in Sequatchie Valley, Tennessee. Later, as he was served as a scout there. He would later be captured in McLemorsville Cove down in Georgia sometime later. But that just gives you an idea of what some of the brethren did during that period. But how it changed the disposition of some brethren. There was a preacher from Texas on one occasion, also spent some time in Kentucky and also in Memphis. His name was B.F. Hall. He was well known during that time. He also joined and was part of a regiment that was encamped in Arkansas. They're fighting the Battle of Pea Ridge very shortly. There were a couple of brethren that realized that he was in the vicinity, and they went out to the encampment there at Fayetteville where they were encamped and to go see him. And these two brethren were William Baxter and Robert Graham. When they got out there and they met up with Brother Hall, they were just absolutely disappointed in seeing how that his whole disposition had changed. He never talked anything about the Lord, never mentioned him, never talked about the church, the Bible, or anything of this nature. The only thing he would talk about was in just contemptuous nature for the Yankee. Bragged about his rifle, was holding his rifle, bragged about it and how many Yankees he was going to kill with it. There was a lot of braggadocio because when the battle took place, the Confederates were routed on that occasion, and the story goes, as I understand it, somebody saw Brother B.F. Hall running, terrified, in retreat. So his braggadocio was not something, his bravery that he just mouthed off was not so great. But just kind of give you an idea again of the attitude of some of the people during that time and the effect that all of this had upon the nation and upon the church. Some 23,000 people died just at Shiloh, is the photograph that you're looking there, in those 2 days. Not to mention all the scars from the other. Thousands upon thousands died in the country. The scars remain. But one of the points that need to be made, my friends, is regardless of the scars that were upon the land and upon the church still, what Christians need to remember is never to allow something like politics to divide the church and have such a detrimental effect on it. Thank you for listening.